So thank you, everybody. You're very welcome to our webinar today, Cybersecurity Post-COVID World. If we could ask everyone who's participating to stay on mute, unless you're one of the speakers. And if you have any questions along the way, please use the Zoom chat function. And as you know, we are videoing this event. Now, we aim to finish early, although it's reserved up till 5. We hope to finish before that. Release some time back to you. So the speakers that we have today, in addition to myself, we have Des Ryan from Microsoft, and we have David McNamara from CommSec. So the message that we would like to leave with you today is that COVID has changed our world in many ways, and we're in a period of accelerated digitization. It's an era in which data is the new currency, and it's also an era in which cyber criminals are innovating to steal your data. So the flow for today, I'll start by talking a little bit about the Data Value Hub. Des will talk about cyber protection in the post-COVID world. Des is the Director of Solutions and the Director of Cybersecurity at Microsoft. And then David McNamara, who's the CEO of CommSec, will talk about ideas on enterprise risk reduction around sensible cybersecurity. We'll then have a panel discussion with Des, David, and myself, and then we'll wrap it up where I'll explain how we can help you engage with the Data Value Hub. So, okay, so just to move on from that. So I'll start by just giving you some background on us at the Hub. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID and why enterprises should care about cybersecurity. I guess the fact that you're on this call, all of you, you're aware of risk, and you therefore have an interest in understanding more. Many of you have already done great things with cybersecurity in your own organization. I'll talk about what we do at the Data Value Hub in the context of all of this. So we think today is the 3rd of June, 2021, but it's not. It's actually 2026. We've been pushed into the future 5 years, and it's a world of 3 new realities. We put our health first. We're working from home in ways that have never been seen before, and digitization is accelerating all around us. When you think of health, we've never seen a pandemic shut down the world economy before. And we've never seen such a fast move to working from home happen so effectively right across all our organizations, right across the world. This couldn't have been possible without digitizing more and more of our activities. But within that accelerated digitization, we've seen new risks emerge. Now, before COVID, when people talked about risk, they weren't talking about pandemics. If you go back to 2019 and you look at any of the analysis on enterprise risk from any of the major reports available, nobody put pandemic up there. Some reports were talking about, at that time, were talking about cyber crime as a risk, but it wouldn't have been seen as a major, huge risk. So COVID has disrupted business, and in this disruption, the cyber criminals have had a field day. So the big changes, when we talk about accelerated digitization, the big changes were already underway. The world was spending over $3.7 trillion on digitization in 2019, the year before the COVID crisis hit. And it was a world of nearly 4 billion active social media users. It was also a world in which businesses were digitizing. Many of the very progressive businesses were already adopting fourth industrial revolution concepts. In a nutshell, make better decisions faster. So organizations like BMW were already using smart technology on the factory floor. The robot reorders the paint in 2.2 milliseconds. There is no procurement department. There is no invoice. There is no delay. It's done fast. Make better decisions faster. But it was also a world in which things were becoming more and more connected, and therefore more and more cyber security risk was emerging. When you think of Maersk Shipping, so again, long before COVID, long before the recent ransomware issues we've seen in the media, Maersk Shipping was taken offline. So about 4 years ago, the world's largest shipping company was hit. All IT systems were offline for over 10 days, and it cost the business $300 million in lost revenue and disruption and all the costs of remediation. Maersk Shipping is a business which has every 15 minutes one of their ships arriving at a port somewhere in the world, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Enormously disruptive when they lost all the data, all that data gone, and they had to scramble, and they got their business back. But the world of today is even more dangerous, and it's estimated that maybe a quarter of all cyber attacks are actually reported to authorities. Many businesses that are attacked fix it without notifying the rest of us, the rest of the world. But that is becoming more and more hazardous when you think about the world of GDPR and other regulatory frameworks which have been introduced at the state level to insist that any breach is reported. So that's the context of the world we're in now. So in this world of increasing risk, it's a world in which businesses are looking to expand their digital footprint out of necessity, make better decisions faster. So we have this conflux of forces here. We have a world of greater and greater cyber threat, and a world in which businesses need to digitize more and more in order to compete, in order to win. So the Data Value Hub is here to help your enterprise compete. So the Data Value Hub is all about helping enterprises deploy artificial intelligence, but with the purpose of boosting productivity and the purpose of enabling new products. And we do this by focusing on data. So there's 3 programs we have available for your enterprise: readiness assessment, incubator projects, and upskilling. And in relation to projects, we're currently talking to 34 different enterprises in one way or another about their AI challenge and how we can help them with a specific project. And when we talk about all of this, and I touched briefly on Industry 4.0, the 4th Industrial Revolution, what we're really talking about is how can you make your business run better? How do you make better decisions faster? How do you automate to win? Bavaria, to pick the example of Bavaria, the Industry 4.0 thinking came from Bavaria. It was actually the chief executive of Bosch who coined the phrase. And he coined the phrase at a time when Bavaria was facing very stiff competition from around the world. So in Vietnam, people will work for $1 an hour in competition to BMW. BMW, based in Bavaria, couldn't compete with that. So how did BMW overcome the challenge? Well, they reframed the question in that challenge. If they could make better decisions faster as an enterprise, the labor component of their decision-making and of their business would not be the showstopper cost line. As I said earlier, the robot reorders the paint in 2.2 milliseconds. There's no procurement department, no invoice, no PO, no receipt docket. It's just done. And 1 million decisions like that a day being made in BMW give them the productivity so they can advance and innovate and produce the beautiful products we're all aware of. So real-time decisions are possible when you have the right frame of mind. If you look at the principles behind Industry 4.0, make better decisions faster, focus on productivity, focus on new product innovation. However, all of this is happening in a world in which cybersecurity is emerging as an enormous threat. A business that thinks well about its physical security must now think more and more about its cybersecurity also. So that's some entry thoughts on our event today, but I'd like to now hand over to Des Ryan. And so I guess over to you, Des. What I'll do, Des, is I will advance the slides on your instruction. Okay.
Thanks, John. Can I just check, are we still in 2026 or are we back in 2021? Because I was starting to feel a little bit old there.
Yeah, it's some people have even said that COVID pushed us a decade into the future.
Yeah, definitely. There's some truth to So look, good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here to speak to you, and thanks to John for the invitation. As he's pointed out, I'm Des Ryan. I'm the Director of Solutions for Microsoft in Ireland. What that means is I lead the sales and technical teams that speak to customers all across Ireland. So in that remit, I sit across all of our solution areas. I'm also Director of Cybersecurity, and in that remit, anytime a customer is impacted by a security issue, I'm the one that will kind of lead out our response and the support of getting the customer back online. Unfortunately, that side of my role is becoming more and more prominent over the last 6 months in particular. I'm going to go to the first slide there, please, John. The slide hasn't moved on. Have you moved the slide on? Okay, there you go. So look, I've been told that this isn't a particularly technical audience and that I should try and keep it fairly high level. So I thought what we might do is we would start with the Microsoft cybersecurity reference architecture, and I'll talk you through every single piece of the puzzle here on this slide. I'm obviously kidding. Look, cybersecurity is a very, very complicated thing, as you can see from this reference architecture. And it's remarkable, really, when you think about how simple some of the threats are, and certainly how simple some of the defenses can be. I'm going to move on to the next slide again. So extortion has been around as long as humanity itself. It's it's long been the case that if you take something that's valuable to somebody, they'll pay you money to get it back, and that might be something physical, or it might even be their good name. What's kind of changed a lot over the last probably last 10 years is that you don't need physical proximity to people anymore to be able to extort them. Previously, in order to get that valuable asset, whatever it might be, you needed to be physically close to them. Whereas with the global connectedness of the internet and the emergence of cryptocurrency as a payment vehicle, you can now extort somebody from the other side of the planet or from the shadows, and that's changed things fairly significantly. Again, you want to move ahead? So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is ransomware, because that is probably the most devastating threat that's out there. But I want you to remember that ransomware is only one part of the threat that's out there. There are lots of other pieces. But definitely, from what I'm seeing, ransomware is another pandemic, if you ask my opinion. So, believe it or not, ransomware has been around since 1989. In 1989, the AIDS Trojan came into play. That was a DOS-based ransomware. It was emailed out with PC Magazine. And so it was almost like a supply chain attack in lots of ways, really a very early supply chain attack. It encrypted the files on people's devices after 90 reboots. So it was based on the BIOS. As the BIOS was booting up, it counted, and when it got to 90, it encrypted the files. And the red message that's on the first left-hand screen there instructed people to send $189 to a PO box in Panama. So this isn't new. This has been around a long time, but it has evolved. It has evolved an awful lot. The first use of Bitcoin can be dated back to 2013 with CryptoLocker. And very, very similar. Your machine gets infected, and your files get encrypted, and you need to pay some money to get back. It evolved further. Then in 2017, we saw WannaCry. WannaCry was very interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it was only around for 3 or 4 days, but in that 3 or 4 days, it hit 200,000 machines across 150 countries. And so also what was interesting about WannaCry, or at least the learning for the cyber criminals in WannaCry, was Nissan, kind of similar to some of the examples already given in terms of Maersk, Nissan had to stop production of their vehicles because of WannaCry, and that was a learning. It was a learning for the criminals that they could have a fairly significant impact on business with these attacks. Whereas previously, and CryptoLocker, and these are just naming 2 or 3 here, there were hundreds. Up until that point, a lot of the ransomware attacks were not targeted at enterprise in particular. They were targeted at your grandmother, your mother, your sister, people's home PCs, and the amount of money that was available from those attacks was pretty small. When the bad guys figured out that if you attack an enterprise, they're more likely to cough up significant money, and hence the continued evolution. I'll talk more about this as we go through the deck. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? So in the course of my role, and in particular in the course of the cybersecurity aspect of my role, unfortunately, I see security incidents very, very regularly. Now, it's very, very topical at the moment in Ireland, and lots of people have become cybersecurity experts very, very quickly because of the publicity surrounding the likes of the HSE. But the HSE is the tip of the iceberg. These headlines that you see on this slide are all from within the last 10 days, and you'll see most of them are actually related to Ireland and Irish companies. I'm intimately aware of and involved in some of these attacks, so I can't talk to you about particular customers. I won't talk to you about particular customers, but I'll be able to give you some insights into the kinds of threats and attacks that are happening, and why you should be looking out for them. The other thing I'll say is, up until the HSE attack, when I spoke to many Irish customers, I often got, Des, you're just trying to scare us here. It's just FUD. Nobody's going to attack an Irish company. Frustratingly for me, I was at the same time talking very, very regularly to customers who were impacted. To give you a bit of a feel, we've got a team called the DART team, the Detection and Response Team. These are the people that actually land into a customer environment when a customer has been compromised. Up until 6 or 7 months ago, we probably had the DART team engaged in Ireland maybe once a half, actually maybe once a quarter, probably once a half for sure. I can point to 9 Irish customers at the moment where the DART team are currently working to help them recover from cyber attack. So it's not just the HSE, it's far, far broader than that. Hence the fact that I say that there's a pandemic of attacks at the moment. It's not just an Irish phenomenon. Again, when I speak to my colleagues globally, there is a spike globally, and the theories that are behind that is the criminals are becoming emboldened by the fact that some fairly high-profile ransoms have been paid. You've all heard the theory that there was a $20 million ransom for the HSE. I'm not going to comment on that in any way, shape, or form, but I can tell you that the largest ransom that's been recorded is 40 million, and there are regularly multi-million-dollar ransom payments made as customers or as enterprises, I should say, are struck by the panic of what one of these attacks can do to a business. Maersk is a great example. Nissan is a great example. A lot of these companies, when they get hit, they are absolutely crippled. And again, I'll talk to you a little bit more about that as we go through the slides. Do you want to go to the next slide, please? This, and you can hit it again just to build it out. This is a slide that's a little bit out of date, but it is, and it probably can be updated by the HSE now. And what I want to try and do with this slide is to indicate to you how devastating a cyber attack can be. So Finabler is the company involved here. You probably know them as Travelex. And a little over a year ago, they came under a cyber attack. The cyber attackers, like a lot of the ones I'm going to talk to you about today, They got into the customer environment many weeks, in fact 6 months they're saying, before they launched the attack. And that's a very common theme. I can tell you that you know, the accounts that I'm working with at the moment, 6 weeks is probably the minimum number, or 6 weeks the minimum number I've heard, from the time that we can trace through logs that the customer came under attack to the time that the attack was actually launched. So somebody somewhere will click on an innocent phishing link that will give the perpetrators access to their credentials in an environment. They'll spend some time looking to do a lateral movement, so a sideways move, to increase the rights that they have with the user ID. And as soon as they get admin access, it's game over. From that point on, they've got complete control of your environment. They will spend some time trying to find what data is valuable to you. And when they have that, they will take a copy of it, and then they will launch the attack. They'll often launch the attack on a weekend or a long weekend to make it more difficult for people to recover. And in Finabler's case, they were reduced to pen and paper. If you're working with the HSE, if you have anybody who interacts with the HSE, their email has been taken offline, and they're using personal email in a lot of instances to stay, to keep the business going. So, you know, these attacks are absolutely devastating for the companies involved. You can see the stock price of Finabler dropped. They've had a double whammy because of travel being stopped because of COVID, but their stock price was £173. You can see how quickly it dropped, and they still haven't recovered. 18 months later, as of today, their stock price is £11. Just to give you an insight into how devastating this stuff is. Next slide, please. So when I speak to customers, sorry, go back. When I speak to customers, I often ask the question. I used to do this when I was physically in a room with people. I'd ask people to put their hand up if people felt that Microsoft were a security vendor. Security is an interesting part of our industry, in that it has a huge amount of niche security vendors, all of whom do something slightly different or defend a particular aspect of the IT infrastructure. And Microsoft has got a very broad range of things that we offer to the market. And so we're not known as a security vendor, but the reality is we're actually the biggest security vendor in the world. You can see from some of the stats on the slide here, we've got $10 billion annually in revenue from our security products globally. And if you look at some of I guess the more recognizable security vendors, the like of a Checkpoint, their revenues are not even half of what Microsoft have in this area. But because of the breadth of what we do, we're not necessarily recognized as a security vendor. We spend $1 billion a year. Again, think about that in terms of the revenue of some of these more niche players on our security research. So we have an incredible security position. And in lots of ways, I think the market is actually coming to Microsoft in terms of the security capability that we've got. If you build the slide out now, you'll see, you know, just to kind of reinforce that, we are recognized by Gartner as leaders in 5 different Gartner Magic Quadrants for security. You can't really see them on the screen here, but you'll see, if you look at the detail here, a lot of the recognizable security vendors are trailing in Microsoft's wake here. So if you want to build the next slide, please. So how come Microsoft have become such a big security player? And the reason for that is what we call a security graph. So Microsoft have got a very broad footprint out on the internet. Whether you're talking about our Hotmail accounts, our Outlook accounts, our Xbox network, or our corporate environments, such as Office 365 or Azure, we've got a huge footprint out there that gives us incredible visibility as to what's going on on the internet, and gives us a great visibility of some of the threats that are out there. Another one that people often forget about is Bing. So we're trawling the internet regularly to index it for Bing, and as we do that, we're finding compromised websites, all of which we're building into our intelligence and our insights. I think the most important thing to say to you in terms of picking a security vendor, security has changed so much over the last 5 years. If you're still thinking perimeter-based security, where you've got a firewall that blocks unknown traffic, you're pretty much out of date. Security changes in seconds, and intelligence is the key to a strong security partner. And with the whatever it is, 8 or 9 trillion signals that we get from our footprint, we've got incredible capability, incredible insights. Go to the next slide. So on top of those insights, we've also got the Microsoft Intelligent Security Association. So there are lots of other partners that we share information with, and that we take some information from. And if you're building your solutions within the Microsoft environment, we're not expecting that you have to use Microsoft products. You can integrate with all of these different technologies on the screen in order to get a security footprint that's best for you. Again, you want to go to the next slide? So with all of those signals and all of that information that's coming into Microsoft, as the screen says here, minutes matter. If you think about Office 365 as an example, we're processing hundreds of millions, if not billions, of emails every single day. And if we see a threat in one email, we're very quickly able to, and we're talking here in seconds and minutes, to block that email from hitting multiple other organizations. So if you're buying Microsoft products, you're buying some of that capability and some of that insight. So there's a huge amount of our security capability built into our products by default. On top of that, we use artificial intelligence to help us sift through all of those signals, to figure out which ones we need to respond to and which ones we don't need to respond to. And importantly, we've also got a team of analysts working in the dark web, constantly looking for threats, looking for zero-day vulnerabilities that we may not be aware of, and responding and updating and patching our software accordingly. Again, do you want to go to the next slide? So the next question is, well, what do we do with all of that information that we've got? Now, Microsoft's mission statement, if you're not aware of it, is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And I think this is a really good example of how we live up to that mission. Nowhere in that mission does it say you need to be a Microsoft customer. So where we see that there is something that is threatening the greater good of the internet, we will move to take things down, whether it's a TrickNet botnet that was recently taken offline, or various other things that we're seeing. So we have the ability to intervene before things happen because of the background and the capability that we've got. Next slide. So what are we seeing? So all that information, and here's where I guess we get into the interesting part of the presentation, and I'm not talking about Microsoft Where so much. So this slide kind of gives you an insight into what it is we're seeing. At the bottom there, and I'm not sure if this deck is going to get shared or not, but the Microsoft Digital Defense Report is a report that we release. It's very comprehensive. It's 100-odd pages. I would encourage you, if you're in any way interested in cybersecurity, to take a look at it. It gives great insights into the kinds of threats that are out there. It breaks it down by geography, breaks it down by industry, and so it's a great source of information. So one that I would certainly encourage you to take a look at. But some of the things on this slide that I'll point to. So top left, 22% of breaches involve phishing. I actually think that number is understated. It's understated fairly significantly. Pretty much every single one of the engagements that I've been involved in from a cyber attack perspective can be traced back to a phishing attack. So I actually think that number is closer to 90%, but that's just the experience that I've got locally here in Ireland. A seven times increase in ransomware attacks in 2020. Absolutely, we're seeing that. And I would say we've seen that again over the last 6 months. There's been a huge spike over the last 6 months. So that's definitely one that I would be calling out as something that I would underline and fully support. The number on the bottom right hand side, you may not be particularly familiar with Ripple 20. That's basically it's going to primarily impact IoT, and the background to that is there is an IP stack that was developed by a particular organization that's been resold and is used in a huge amount of IoT devices, and that IP stack has been shown to be vulnerable. And the reason it's called Ripple 20 is because that one issue has rippled out across a number of organizations. It's estimated that somewhere in the region of 100,000 IoT devices are already out there and deployed that are affected by Ripple 20. So that's one to watch. I think IoT security is going to be one to watch over the coming years. You'll have seen, if you follow Microsoft, you'll have seen we've made some acquisitions in the IoT space. CyberX was one that we made maybe 18 months ago, and there was another one announced overnight, Refirm, where we're moving further and further into being able to secure IoT. So if you are working in an IoT type environment, keep track of that and keep track of Ripple 20. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about ransomware. So if you roll the clock back and look at the left-hand side of this slide, you'll see that there was a fairly significant drop year on year in ransomware attacks between 2017 and 2020. Those were ransomware attacks that were broad-based. They weren't targeted. And those are the attacks that I was talking to you about that potentially going after your mother or your grandmother or your family, basically home users, non-commercial entities. But as I pointed out to you earlier with WannaCry, which was around the 2017 mark, that's when cybercriminals realized that if they were to change tact and be targeted in their approach rather than broad-based, apologies for the dog in the background. That's when they realized that if they were targeted in their attacks, they could end up with a far more significant payback. So you can see it's almost symmetrical. The drop in ransomware attacks has been almost exactly mirrored by targeted ransomware attacks. So these are attacks against specific commercial entities. Again, do you want to go to the next slide, please? So this slide is why, and I don't think you need to be a rocket scientist to figure this one out. There's higher payments available from enterprise than from an end user. These attacks are so devastating that sometimes it's a business decision that the business needs to keep running, and the only way they're going to keep running is if they get back up and running quickly. So there's a lot more pressure in the commercial world to pay a ransom. As John has pointed out, not everybody reports the fact that they've been attacked. And so brand damage is another reason why some people pay ransom, to try and keep it on the QT. And cyber insurance, up until I think it was last week, cyber insurance was also often used to cover the cost of the ransom. You may have seen that AXA have said that they're going to stop underwriting the payment of ransom because it's become so prevalent. And interestingly enough, as soon as they said that, they came under attack themselves. Again, do you want to go to the next slide? So this is the next level of detail then in terms of what attacks are there, and this is a fairly simplified graph. But I guess a couple of points that I'll make in terms of it. There's really 3 or 4 at the moment. There are really 3 or 4 primary attack types. Those will be the Conti, Netwalker, Sodinokibi, and Ryuk. Those are the ones that we encounter most. Interestingly about them is that they are not gangs directly doing ransomware attacks anymore. It's now ransomware as a service. Where people, just general criminals, will effectively license the ransomware technology. They will launch it at whoever they feel they want to get at, and they'll get paid 86% of, and this is in the case of Netwalker, they get paid 86% of whatever ransoms get paid, up to 300,000. So if it's $300,000 a week, the affiliate or the person who's licensing the technology gets paid 86% of that. So you're seeing that the criminal gangs are now retreating from being the ones that are doing the attackers, and they're licensing out their technology. The Sodinokibi and Conti are also very similar in terms of their mode of attack. The other interesting thing to see on this screen, the red bars on the bottom right-hand side, so that's SamSam. I'm not sure if you're familiar with cybersecurity, you've been working in this area, you'll know this already. But I guess for the broader business audience, just point out to you, SamSam stopped very, very abruptly at the end of 2018. And if you go to the next slide, I can kind of show you why. And the reason why is because at the end of 2018, the FBI got involved, and they actually identified who was behind SamSam, and they put them on the most wanted list. And as soon as that happened, the guys behind it disappeared. They haven't been brought to justice. They haven't been captured. But SamSam as a threat disappeared. Now, in this case, the 2 individuals are Iranians, not thought to be a nation-state attack, as many of the others are. Yeah, they disappeared. And that was a fairly significant moment in terms of cybersecurity. The reason being, the FBI was the first major FBI move in this space. FBI have got an incredible capability. I was lucky enough to see a special agent from the FBI presenting on their capability last year. They have stepped up significantly what they're doing in this area, because ransomware has become such a threat to American industry. If it was just general crime, they may not be so interested, but it has become such a threat and so impactful that they have really, really stepped up their capability. If you ever come under attack, I'd always encourage you to make sure whoever you're working with is reaching out to the FBI, because in the background, they have the ability to, some of the more common threat types, they have the ability to help you out, let's put it that way. You want to move again? So again, I'm going to go back to a lot of what I've talked about there was ransomware, and it is, as I said, the most devastating and the most impactful for business. But you can see, according to this, which comes from our defense report, ransomware only accounts for about 6% of all of the malware that we're seeing. The biggest, it's less threatening and less of an issue, but the biggest in terms of volume is coin mining, so crypto coin mining, and that's where criminals will get you to click on a link, and they will put some software on your PC, and they will use your PC to help them mine for cryptocurrency. Doesn't really damage your machine in any particular way, but they're using your resources. What's probably most interesting when you break into the geographies of crypto mining, so this is a global number, 41%. In the UK and Ireland, that 41% goes to 87%. So 87% of all of the malware in UK and Ireland is actually crypto mining. I've no theory as to why that is, so don't ask me that. but it is an interesting observation. Again, do you want to move ahead, please? So Microsoft in Ireland over the last couple of years, I've been lucky enough to lead out on a couple of pieces of local research that I guess I'll talk you through a little bit here. So the first piece of research was in 2019, then we repeated it just as COVID was hitting in 2020. So in 2019, what we did was we went out and we spoke to end users of enterprise accounts. So these are people who work for major organizations on the island of Ireland. So this was both North and South. And we asked them about how they use their technology. There was a particular security bent to it, but it was quite broad in terms of, you know, how they use their technology. In 2020, we revisited it, but this time we talked to business decision makers and we asked them what their perspectives were. It's really interesting now, and with COVID having hit, some of what we found in this research is pretty alarming. So if you want to jump ahead, I can give you some of that insight. But before I do, so Microsoft have got a huge range of different technologies that we offer from a security perspective. But we break things into four main categories. Identity and access management. So that's about you and identifying who you are on the corporate environment. Threat protection. So that's technology that's used to block at the endpoint any potential vulnerabilities. Information protection, and that's what we're talking about, protecting your data and stopping your data from being leaked out of your organization. And the final category then is around cloud security, and so, you know, how you interact with technologies like Azure. So in those four main categories, if you go to the next slide, we've broken out some of the main findings from the research. So this is the 2019 research, and across the four categories. So if I'm not going to go through each of these, but I'll kind of give you a couple of them, particularly ones that are interesting in terms of COVID and the fact that everybody rushed to work from home. So 16% of organizations don't require or didn't require people to change their passwords regularly. That's alarmingly high. You know, good password policy is absolutely critical. And, you know, there occasionally is a reason why you wouldn't do it, but that 16% it's actually ridiculous when you think about it. The bottom left-hand side is probably where some of the biggest concerns for me were at the time. 36% of people admitted that they backed up the corporate data to their personal backup devices. So this is where somebody's taken files off of a corporate device and put it onto their backup. So like a home hard drive. If you think about that for a second and you say, GDPR, where is that data? Who has access to that data now? Who's controlling that data? That is a major GDPR exposure for the companies involved. Think about it now in terms of COVID, you have all of these people working remote. There's probably more of a likelihood that that number will have gone up. It'll be interesting to see when we run this research again, what that number comes out at. The one at the bottom, again, very interesting. This is pre-COVID. 49% of people who worked remotely are using personal email when working with regard to their work files when they're working from home. The theory here is that, you know, somebody, rather than bringing their laptop home or not having a laptop, are emailing files to their home PCs through a personal email system, working on the file at home and then emailing it back to themselves. Again, major exposure in terms of GDPR. So yeah, those are a couple. In terms of your first line of defense, always in security is awareness, user awareness. So 46% of people having no security training was also a bit of a concern. So yeah, I guess I won't go into too many more of those, but just to kind of give you a feel. So there was a whole bunch of what I would call poor work practices before COVID hit, that you then assume have continued, or you need to assume have continued into the post-COVID world. I'm going to go to the next slide. it'll be the employer version of this research. And so, 76% of senior managers are worried about ongoing digital threats. And so they should be. I think, what I'm seeing, it is a major threat. So 76% doesn't surprise me. I don't think we can ever take the threat away. So, there will probably always be people worried. But it does tell you that there are a lot of people out there that are concerned. 70% of large firms have experienced problems in phishing or cyber attacks. I wonder about the other 30. I'm pretty sure that number is 130% of people don't realize that they have been. So you can see fairly similar. Lots of people talking about investing more in their security footprint and trying to hire more talent. And there's definitely a talent shortage in the security world. So that was the second round of research that we've done. If you want to go to the next slide again. And I'll talk to you a little bit about COVID specifically. So, obviously, whatever it was, 14 or 16 months ago, COVID hit, lockdown kicked in, and everybody scrambled to kind of keep their business running and to enable people to work from home. At the time, we certainly had a huge surge in work. I'm very proud to say that Microsoft Teams has enabled, even though we're not using it today, naughty, it has enabled customers to keep going and keep doing business, keep business running through COVID. So we had a huge surge in the uptake of Teams. We had also the spike in PC orders as people were enabling people to work remotely. So there was a massive move early in the lockdown. And Satya Nadella, our CEO, said at the time that we saw 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. And I think that's probably a fair comment. That pace of change, though, brings with it security risks. So, in the rush to respond to the lockdown, undoubtedly shortcuts were taken, or business decisions were made that it was more important to get people running than to have the utmost security in place. So we had this first wave in COVID where people were trying to get up and running remotely. We then had a second wave of activity, probably 6 months later, where we saw a huge spike in the likes of Windows Virtual Desktop. And so what was happening there was our customers were realizing that all of a sudden data was outside of their environment. It was out in the wild, so to speak. And they started to pull the data back. And instead of having the data out on machines, they were presenting it out through a virtual desktop environment. So there were a number of different technologies that we saw like that, where customers were going back to retrofit security or appropriate security to the environments that developed at the very start of COVID. I'm expecting there'll be a third wave as customers return to the office. So lots of you and lots of people, in fact, have their corporate device at home now. You might find that they're doing online yoga or online meditation, or their kids might be doing online learning classes. There will be a huge amount of additional credentials and software installed on corporate devices while they were out in the wild that will need to be looked at as these devices return to the office environment. So that's one that I'm expecting to see a little bit over the next few months. And if you go to the next slide, which I think is my last slide, I'm going back to where I started. And this is the very same slide I showed you at the very start of the presentation, but I've circled one particular headline because it's very recent and it's an interesting evolution. So about 3 weeks ago, I got a call from, in fact, it was the same weekend that the HSE cyber attack hit. I got a call from the NCSC, the National Cybersecurity Centre, to say that a number of ISPs in Ireland, internet service providers, were under attack, were under a DDoS attack. Most of them were non-mainstream, so they were predominantly rural. And the reason I was getting a phone call, just as an aside, is that some of the machines being used in the attack were housed in customer environments within Azure, and they wanted to see if we could do anything to turn them off. Obviously, if it's a customer environment, we don't have the right to do that. We have subsequently, of course, worked with those customers to take the threat offline. But this was an interesting one because I believe it's also COVID related, with lots of people working remotely and using their own ISP to keep connected to corporate environments. The fact that the ISPs were under DDoS attack meant that they were being taken off air. And these attacks, very, very similar to most of the ransomware attacks, they basically flood the ISP's internet connection and tell them they won't stop until they pay a ransom. So it was just an interesting and very, very recent phenomenon that I believe is COVID related. So that's my last slide. Thank you for listening. Hopefully some of this was interesting. I've tried not to be too salesy, and hopefully you got something from it. I'm happy to take questions, or John, if you prefer to wait till the very end and we do a panel, up to you.
What we'll do is we'll cover questions at the panel, Des, but no, thank you for that that insightful assessment of things. And it's very sobering what you've said, you know, that we're experiencing a pandemic of ransomware. So in the early days of COVID, you know, more digital change in 2 months than typically in 2 years. And then of course, everyone working remotely and all of the additional threats that introduces to the enterprise. And of course, the ransomware issue itself, probably the centerpiece of cyber threat, but it's not the only threat out there. And people paying ransoms of in one case, perhaps $40 million. And many people paying ransoms and never reporting it to the media. And it's interesting how Microsoft have positioned the company, how Microsoft is now positioned within a broad ecosystem of other companies with the same intention of, you know, driving this threat away as hard as possible. Obviously working with FBI and other state agencies around the world, including here in Ireland, to help with that. But it's interesting too how you talked about the contrast between employee behavior and you know, employer behavior, and in particular on bad habits, you know, policy, you know, behavioral at the individual level, and then of course policy at the enterprise level, where password changes are not enforced and other things like that, just opening the door and inviting disaster, you know. Thank you, Des. We'll move on now to hear from David McNamara, the CEO and founder of CommSec. So I'll advance the slides in a similar way, David, and hand over to you now.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks for the opportunity to speak here this afternoon. Really delighted to be a member of such an illustrious panel like Des. And Des, thank you. I think, you know, everything you've said there is absolutely spot on, and it mirrors what we see in the Irish market in particular, because that's where we're focused. So if you can go on to the next slide, I'll just maybe give a little overview of what it is I'm going to talk about. I'll just briefly explain who we are, what we're about, some of the business landscape that's out there, what we're seeing, what are the types of threats, and then what are the simple things you can do. I always believe if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there, to coin a phrase. But having a plan for implementation of a cybersecurity strategy, and I don't want to overcomplicate things either. I want to keep it real. So it's just, well, where am I? Where is my posture against best practice? And then what do I need to shore up straight away in order to, you know, block holes that are in my security posture, whether it's vulnerabilities that are known, or whether it's, you know, just bad password but no policies in place. So where do we start? And then where do I spend my money? I think that's one of the most important, because people will, and vendors out there will be trying to get you to spend money on antivirus, on password management, and on security awareness training, and you just don't know where to start. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, a couple of case studies as well, and then we'll get into the Q&A then for the panel afterwards. So go to the next slide, please. So who we are, well, first of all, we're certified to the International Information Security Standard, the ISO 27001. So I'm sure some of you have heard of that standard, but we also certified to the Cyber Essentials, which is a basic standard that I think most companies should actually even think of in terms of looking at the security posture, and it covers 5 essential areas, and I'll talk about that a little later on. We started in 2013, fully Irish owned. I'm ex-Defence Forces. I spent a number of years in IBM, Fujitsu, and even Aircom for a number of years. So that's kind of my background. I think we like to give just pragmatic, straight, sensible advice that there's no BS about. And the team that we have are absolutely excellent. We've an ex-Garda detective in the National Crime Bureau, works with us, heads our forensics division. We've also then got people who've set up security operations centers, penetration testing. So we do a little bit of that. It's always about service. We're an MSSP, so it's service-led. And we believe in long-term relationships and going the extra mile, and not just, can we sell you something and get out of there? It's about the relationship. So go to the next one, please, John. So these are some of our customers, varying from the Irish Horse Racing Regulatory Board, formerly the Turf Club, to Irish Times, Apex Fund Management, Primeline Group, TaxPack, and Origin Enterprises. So they're just some of the clients we deal with that allow us to talk about them. So next slide, please, John. So some of our services, we obviously do information security audits and assessments. We're ISO 27001 lead implementers. We also audit to the Cyber Essentials standard. We do penetration testing, Chief Information Security Officer as a service. So this is most companies who don't have that, or don't have the money or the need for a full-time resource, look to us to provide that as a service, where we maybe do something between 2 and 5 days a month. And we also offer data protection officer as a service. So in our managed services service, we do SOC, which is Security Operations Center. And kind of like Microsoft, we have our analysts that will look through the dark web, also be using SIEM tools. So we use AT&T's Alien Vault, which does a lot of threat detection, and we actually share some of the findings that we find in the Irish market up to the OTX, which is the largest threat intelligence platform in the world. So that allows other organizations that use the AT&T Alien Vault SIEM, that if there's a threat notified, that's notified instantly to all instances of the Alien Vault SIEM, no matter what company is using it. We have our own vulnerability scanning service called CheckScan Plus. Cyber Risk Aware, so this is education for users. It's an Irish company, and we are an MSP for them, and we've integrated that into our Security Operations Center. So should somebody click on a link that they shouldn't have, it automatically enrolls them into a cyber awareness training course. We also have multi-factor authentication, or two-factor authentication with Duo, which is a Cisco product, and we also do firewall as a service with Palo Alto, and with password management and antivirus. So they're the kind of list of services that we have. If you could go on to the next, please. As I mentioned, we started a digital forensics practice just over a year ago, and that's headed up by a former detective. He spent 12 years in the National Cyber Crime Bureau as a Garda detective, and before that, he was a sys admin with Garda HQ IT. So forensic and e-discovery is what we do, and it's a branch of forensic science that focuses on identifying, acquiring, and analyzing, reporting on data stored on a computer or a digital device, such as mobile phones, for example, and other media. And it's a post-mortem of an incident that may have happened that you want to try and gather the evidence for. So on to the next slide, please. So we also use this digital forensics in part of incident response or damage control. So if you have an incident, you want to know, well, what data has been breached, where it has been breached, how much of it has left the organization, how did the attackers get in, who the attackers are, what type of intellectual property has been taken out of the organization, or in some cases, we do cases for the legal community where we're looking at kind of property theft, fraud, sexual harassment, and any other evidence that we can find on devices, where we will present that in a court, and we have what's known as an expert witness capability as well with Column. So just move on from that. Don't really delve too much into that. Thanks, John. So some of the information security landscape. So 16%, and this is based on the Verizon report, and I think Des also mentioned this as well, that one of the biggest we're seeing is phishing, and the phishing emails and the targeted phishing emails, we're seeing a huge increase in that, and it's much more than 20-odd%. But it's all different areas of business that are being hit. And the most interesting is, particularly for this audience, that nearly half are SMEs. So, and sometimes, we're talking about fines here of, 40 million or 20 million. You'll find a lot of SMEs will get hit for maybe 1,000, 2,000 euros. And you think, okay, well, that's not much. I could afford to pay that. But well, I'd still recommend not to. And the reason being is because, one, there's no way you can tell whether the attackers will give you the data back, whether they haven't already sold it. As in the case of the HSE, as we've seen, is that some of the data is already sold to third-party criminals who are already actively going out and using that data to gain monetary fraud with individuals. So we're already seeing that happening. The second thing is, even if you do get the data back, and it's unscrambled from the encryption that the hackers have put in terms of the ransomware that they've used, then it's likely to be corrupt. So you might not get it back in the time that you think it's going to be. So it's much more than the cost of the ransom. It's your brand, it's your reputation. And that's, as CISOs, that's what we look for, is how do I protect my brand and reputation? And it's mostly PII, so personal identifiable information that is stolen, and it's most common data. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So again, these are all the types of industries that have been hit. So if you look at down, it's accommodation, it's administrative, agriculture, construction, education. There's nobody safe, basically. Like some are more targeted than others. Public sector, for example, is a huge one, and so is entertainment. Because people are, obviously looking at Netflix now, and they're looking at Disney and what have you, and you'll get phishing lures out there asking people to click on links, including delivery organizations or logistics companies as well. So if you maybe go on from that, please. And again, these are all the different types of attacks and the different patterns that are out there. So one of the biggest one is your web application. So that's the one that kind of gets hit the most. And there's the methods that they're using now. The biggest one that we're seeing is social engineering. So social engineering is when somebody will ring you up pretending to be your IT provider, for example, asking to log onto your machine. Just click on this link that I'm about to send you, and we'll sort out this the suspect image that you have on your computer or whatever it might be. But they also can come in, they look at your Facebook profiles, for example, to gain some information on you. So if you use things like your birthday on Facebook and your cousins are there, and they now have your maiden name, your mother's maiden name, your date of birth, your name. So I would recommend don't put any of that stuff up on Facebook or any other social media. So if we move on now to the next one, please. So it's not just SMEs that get attacked. So we've had instances where BA was attacked, for example, Google themselves, and Hermes. So again, it's not just the SMEs that get hit, it's any organization. So there's nobody safe. And even the resources that these big companies have in terms of putting in layers of security, they still can get hit. And I would agree with what Des mentioned earlier on, is that it's really the biggest source of infections that come in is actually from internal users not being educated. So that's one thing I would recommend that you do, is educate your users. We go to the next one, please. So what are the business challenges that companies are facing? Well, you have business continuity you have to do, you have legal obligations, you have reputation and transparency, you're trying to defend against criminal activity, and you're looking for solutions appropriate to today's needs. So you're in a COVID situation where everybody was sent home to work effectively with not having the protection that was offered internally in your own business. So with proper firewalls, VPNs, even the routers that are at home can be attacked. And if I know you're the CIO or the financial director of an organization, I know where you live, I can sit outside your house, hack into your Wi-Fi, do a man-in-the-middle attack and find out what you're sending out and encrypting. It's that easy, and it can be done. Vendor management, cost effectiveness, these are all the areas that are the challenges for businesses. So where do you start with IT security, and what do you do? So next slide, please. So we've normally started with an audit, and as I mentioned at the start, it's where do I begin? So you have to understand where your posture is, and what's good and what's bad about the security you have in place. So, and you need that from an objective third-party review. And you also want that team to use recognized methodologies and tools, such as ISO, or indeed the Cyber Essentials. And look, it confirms what's working effectively, what's not. It looks at the vulnerabilities that you may have. So there's known and unknown vulnerabilities, and that's where with vulnerability scan, we'll look at the known vulnerabilities, and if you do a penetration test, that's where an actual certified ethical hacker or CEH person will actually be able to look and see, well, how else could I get in, escalating privileges, for example. And then you need to look at the remediation recommendations, and you rank them by priority. And that also establishes your budget. You say, well, what do I need to spend on straight away? And then what can I spend over a period of time? And as long as you're doing that, the Data Protection Commissioner will understand. So if there is a data breach, they look and say, well, at least you were trying to start and put in place some of the effectiveness and security considerations that you needed to. So any fines that are bandied about, and again, the people are using this in terms of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And the fact that it's 10 million or 4% of your revenue, the Data Protection Commissioner isn't out to do you like that. It will be a proportion of, well, what mitigations had you put in place? Did you have your laptops encrypted, for example? So these are different things. So you go on to the next one, please. So the methodology, as I mentioned, we look at all different areas. So the ISO, Cyber Essentials, and then there's technical recommendations from Microsoft that we use as well. And then the NIST, the US National Institution Standards as well, because we deal with some American entities as well. And these are all carried out by actually qualified, certified auditors that we use for internal audit and for external audit. So if you go to the next one, please, John. So what's involved with the 27001? Well, there's, depending on the size of your organization, this can be quite onerous. So you have information security policies, the organization, information security, your HR side, your asset management, your access control, your ops security, your communication security, system acquisition and maintenance, supplier relationships, so the business continuity management. So there's an awful lot in that. So, and again, it depends on the size of your organization, or not necessarily the size, but what is your business? Are you a bank, a small bank? Are you dealing with sensitive information to deal with, people's passport numbers, insurances, whatever it might be. So it just depends on your business. So next one, please, John. So part of the outcomes are the agreed scope and circulation. What are the key findings? We rank them in order of significance. We look for a management response and whether they're actionable by the entity that we're auditing or by ourselves. So next one, please. And then the cyber essentials one. So this it's basically, it's the essentials that you need. So you need to look at your kind of your firewalls and your internet gateways, and look at how they're configured and what other secure configuration you have in place, how much access control you have, both physically and logically, what malware protection. So are you running antivirus? And one of the biggest things that you can do is your patch management. And I know it's a pain and everybody complains about it, that here you go, here's another Microsoft update yet to do, but they are essential for protecting and shoring up vulnerabilities that are out there. So we have what's called as Patch Tuesday, where Microsoft released their patching for vulnerabilities that they find in the code, and that's updated every Tuesday, Wednesday here, it kind of gets to. But that's closely followed by what's now known as Threat Thursday, where cyber criminals will find out, well, these vulnerabilities are fixed. Here's some more we're going to exploit. And they're the ones that they try, and what's known as kind of 0-day attacks, because the vulnerabilities haven't been shored up. So next, please, John. So why do you need cyber essentials? And looking at that as even the basic standard. So you'll prevent around 80% of the cyber attacks by just putting those in place. You can also demonstrate to your customers that you're actually adhering to a standard for supply chain security. You could win new business. You could use it as a competitive advantage over your competitors to say, well, we adhere to these standards. What are your competitors doing? You can help drive business efficiency. So looking at your core business objectives and just, and that's what you can focus on, because maybe security isn't your business. You can also help reduce your cyber insurance premiums by actually saying to them, well, I adhere to these standards. Does that affect my insurance? And typically it would do. And then if you're dealing with the UK, it's a standard. It is a UK standard, but it is recognized here by the NCSC, so the National Cybersecurity Centre. So you could actually talk to Irish government here and even mention you have that standard, and it will be viewed on favorably. So at least you have standards that you're adhering to. So next one, please, John. So again, some of the benefits, by putting in place this, you've got brand protection, you identify some vulnerabilities, and you can shore those up. It forms part of your business continuity plan. You now have a known security posture, so you know how good or bad you are, and you can recognize good security processes, put in place policies and products that suit your business and that you can afford. And that's the most important thing. You can inform external auditors or the data protection commissioner if there's any queries for data leakage or a breach. And you can also prioritize action items. And as I said, it becomes a framework for your security strategy that maybe you implemented over a period of 3 years or 5 years, depending on what you can afford as a business, but also what are the key areas you need to shore up, focusing on PII. Okay, so next one, please, John. So this is one of our case studies of companies who've actually used it for their audits. So this was a healthcare provider. Now it wasn't the HSE. They were part of the HSE, or they are part of the HSE, but they're a smaller known entity. And they were concerned they had a distributed network with multiple sites all over the country. The clients were vulnerable adults and children. They had uncertainty around GDPR and phishing, and they didn't have many people in IT to help them with. So they wanted to protect their reputation, clearly, but also to protect the data for their vulnerable adults and children that they had a duty of care to. And they were subject to strict internal and external audits themselves. So they wanted to get a security audit. It helped provide clarity. It gave them a framework for action and an awareness at board level. And this is often the problem, is that the higher ups in an organization may not have a full appreciation of cybersecurity, but I see that that's starting to change now. And unfortunately, there's a silver lining in every cloud, and the HSE has raised that profile, so that particular case, so which is good for overall security postures for all businesses. Just to the next case study, please, John. This is another company we did. This was an insurance company, but they were a reinsurance, so that they were again in multi-countries, so they distributed sites. Wanted a framework again, just to have all of the group adhere to a security framework. Again, they'd stretched IT resources, and that seems to be a common trend in the industry. And they want to protect their reputation, obviously. And again, because they're an insurance company, they had big audit, internal and external. So they were subject to that. So again, it provided clarity, a framework for action and awareness at board level. So just the next slide, nearly finished now, so we can. So some of the key messages I would say to you is that one is know your organization security posture and the vulnerabilities you have. Don't just trust the security tools. Just putting in antivirus does not protect you. It only protects for the viruses that vulnerability service actually knows about. So that's the other thing. It doesn't cater for zero-day attacks or rootkits that may be installed in somebody's laptop or computer. Monitor your network for the unseen threats. Review your logs. Invest in IT and know-how. Educate your users is the most important thing you can do, and protect your brand and reputation. So just on to the next one, please. So the top things that you need to do to secure your infrastructure, again, number one, educate your users to what to look out for. Enable two-factor, multi-factor authentication on your systems. Those two things alone will cover you between 80 to 90% of the threats that are out there. Patch your systems with the latest updates. Again, I said, I know it's a pain, but it is necessary. Review your firewall and other public-facing devices that you have for secure configuration. Review your logs, use a SIEM if possible. If not, get somebody who knows what to look for in your IT organization. Encrypt your laptops and other removable media, both at rest and when it's on the move. And perform vulnerability scans and our pen tests at least once a year. So they're the things I have, John. Hopefully that was interesting enough for people. And look, happy to talk about this and other questions.
Thanks, David. So it's interesting how you've described it, and it's amazing how the hazard of targeted attacks, where the cyber criminal will investigate your social media profile to identify your passwords, perhaps, or your date of birth, form a full picture on you before the attack is planned, and the importance of conducting an audit to know where is the organization today. Get a baseline of the current threat position, an important point you've made as well, and also. Organizations needing to be fully aware of the risk of a fine for a data breach. Des touched on this as well, that if there's data leakage of sensitive, personally identifiable information, subject to GDPR rules, obviously, therefore, that invites further hazards. So often in a ransomware attack, it's compounded by a fine that follows in its wake. So in addition to perhaps reputational damage, loss of business, you have these other fines coming in, and so it can be quite nasty in the absence of having an audit of where are you today. And the importance of educating the end users came up from both of you, David and Des, the importance of end user behavior, but also the importance of the organization to take cybersecurity threat seriously, and to get the basics in place, and to understand what the investment needs to be, rather than being penny wise and pound foolish. So what might have been considered in the past as optional investment is becoming essential investment for a business. And it's terrible to see how many organizations have had to learn that message the hard way. In fact, if you think of the organizations that have been hit hardest by recent cybercrime, they've had to now invest in a crisis to, patch up the problem and then move on. Prevention would have been a much less painful experience for them. It's hard to preach that at people. People have to learn for themselves. But I suppose that's the purpose of today's event, is to talk about what are the ideas. So what we're going to do now is move to our panel discussion. So this is really where, we'll start with I suppose really a conversation, Des, David, and myself, and then we'll invite obviously questions from the audience. But one of the things that comes up a lot in 2021 is the adoption of cloud services. We've seen over the past decade the concept grow from early adopters using it to now widespread adoption. I mean, most organizations are now using at least one cloud hosted service, and yet some organizations are afraid of that. They see cloud as being a major threat. So the argument that we prefer to run our services internally on our own servers, keep our data within our four walls, or manage it maybe with a controlled third party in a controlled data center. That model, many people would say, I prefer that model to cloud. So how does an organization make the rational choice here without inviting the hazard of cybercrime? That's really, I suppose, the question. I don't know, Des, from your side, is that something you're seeing with Microsoft clients, this persistent fear of cloud?
Well, there's still, unfortunately, there still is a lot of preconceived ideas about cloud and how secure it is. You kind of need to break it down into components. There's no question that the physical security of an Azure data center or any of the hyperscaler data centers is better than anything any normal company can afford to build. If you haven't had a chance to do one of the virtual tours of the data center, and you'll see the level of security that's built in from a physical perspective. It's astounding. It really is astounding. On top of that, then you have the logical, and depending on what you're consuming, obviously with cloud, you can have anything from infrastructure as a service, right, to PaaS. The unpatched devices, depending on which level of service you're buying, that can all get automated, and there's no question that the rigor in the control and patching of a cloud environment is stronger than the majority of on-prem scenarios. There is still a bit of a reticence, but it's what's particularly fascinating at the moment. Is I mentioned earlier that there's been a real spike in attacks, and I'm intimately involved in a number of them. And every one of the ones that I'm currently involved in are on-prem. So none of them are customers who are in the cloud. And the theories, obviously lots of different perspectives and thoughts about why that is. My personal theory is twofold. One is an on-prem environment would be viewed as quite old school in approach, and maybe a little bit more cost conscious in approach. And therefore, it's more likely in an on-prem environment that you will have unpatched devices or old operating systems deployed, or whatever that might be. And so that might be what's attracting more attacks on on-prem environments. The second one, when you move to cloud, there are a whole number of monitoring services that kick in. You might have your own, but obviously Microsoft are monitoring our environments constantly. And moving to cloud, the lateral movements, again, if you think about how an attack happens, an endpoint gets compromised, then they spend time trying to do a lateral move to get more and more credentials, and then they go searching for your data. You're more likely to discover some of those lateral movements in a cloud environment than you would be in an on-prem environment. So paradoxically, it is actually, at the moment, I can say hand on heart, it is now safer in the cloud than it is on-prem, from both my own experiences of our customers in the cloud, but also in terms of what I'm seeing actively over the last 6 months in particular, in terms of attacks in Ireland.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it, as you've pointed out, that all of the recent cases, it's on-premise infrastructure that's hit where the ransomware managed to get in, whereas on public cloud, whether it's infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, not seeing anything happening over there. It's incredible. So this is a big change. I mean, that data must shift perceptions.
Yeah, it should. I think the important thing to say, though, is moving to cloud isn't the panacea. If you spin up a server on Azure or our competitors' technologies, and you do nothing to it other than just leave it there, within 4 hours, it'll be compromised. You still have to own your own security posture. You still need to make sure your configurations are good. There's only so much that the cloud provider will be offering. It's a shared endeavor. So, you know, cloud is, if it's used properly, cloud is the safest place to be, without question.
And it's interesting as well, Des, how many software providers are now, you know, moving to a cloud-first strategy for the service. So if you think of providers like Salesforce.com or Workday.com or other software providers, indeed Microsoft as well, there is no on-premise option. There is only the cloud option for that software. And it would seem then that many tech companies, as a consequence of this cloud-first strategy, they're putting all their energy into the product performance and stability and security on the cloud version, and maybe they're starting to just abandon on-premise offerings altogether.
Yeah, there's no question, not just from a security perspective, but you will find that features and functions these days will always appear in cloud offerings first. It's just a fact of life.
Yeah, so there's a broader concern there for businesses. And David, with endpoint protection, I mean, one of the things we've seen as another big change in business over these past years is the wider and wider adoption of smartphones, that business is conducted on the smartphone almost in preference to the laptop in many cases. And often those devices are personally owned, not corporately owned by the enterprise. And so it must represent another threat to the business in that sense. Is that something you're seeing a problem with as well for businesses?
Well, absolutely. And it's one of the biggest growing areas of cybersecurity breaches is through the smartphone. And because a lot of companies now are allowing, you know, bring your own device to work, for example. So you've got personal data on a device as well as company data. And it's how do you segregate that off, and how do you protect the company data without exposing it to any of the personal data that's on there. And the crossover that's there is hard to manage for a lot of companies, but there are solutions out there that can actually do that. in terms of mobile device management and BYOD. So, you know, it is stoppable, but it's educating users of what not to click on, and to verify that any texts that they get, you know, have come from the actual source, even though they might look very legitimate. I'd never give out personal data over the phone. I wouldn't click on any links. I'd actually visit the website on my laptop to make sure it is the actual website of the one I type in, not the one that's leading me there.
It's interesting, David, as well, how some of the banks have stopped their app-based banking service. So one particular bank, Permanent TSB, have, you know, abandoned it. So you can't use the smartphone app anymore because it was, I guess, seen as a threat. So it's only via laptop that it's possible, laptop or PC, to access their online banking.
Well, I'm not sure on PTSB, but part of the problems, you've got the marketing side of a bank telling you, you know, to how easy it is to do business with us, and then you actually have the business side of the bank. Oh no, protect your data. We'd never ask you for that information, and never the two meet. You know, so it's actually really interesting to see that even banks are starting to move away from that. I disagree that they should. I think they've just got to make it more secure, and they've got to educate the users on what not to do, and that's, you know, stop the mixed messaging between marketing and the actual security side of the business banking. Yeah.
And Des, you know, you also talked a lot about the risk in enterprises of you know, IoT threat. So, you know, IoT has a big promise for businesses, you know, Internet of Things, a way to automate decisions, you know, accelerate, you know, productivity journeys, and reduce errors and waste and delays in a business. So IoT has a huge value, and we've seen it, you know, again, it's one of these technologies that's erupting all around us. Yeah. And it's fascinating that it's also a threat vector. You know, I think perhaps traditional thinking would have said, no, there's no way they can come at us this way, and yet it's an emerging threat. You mentioned Ripple 20 as an example of something that's a threat there. But how can businesses even become aware of that? Because it seems the nature of the technology is less, how can you put it? It's less obvious if it's being compromised, perhaps.
Yeah, well, yes and no. I think, you know, obviously IoT has a very significant future. You know, all of the major tech companies will talk to you ad nauseum about, you know, the future where everything is connected and your fridge is making decisions on your behalf, etc. And that is going to be led by IoT. There are different kinds of IoT devices. There are sensors, there are smarter versions of them. But anything that's connected to the internet can be used as a weapon. Now, you may not get compromised, your own organization may not get compromised by an IoT device or an IoT sensor, but they can be enrolled in zombie bots. And can be used in denial of service attacks. So there are lots of different potential risks there. Biggest problem I think at the moment with IoT is they're trying to drive down the price of the sensors. As you drive down the price, then you know, I think you're potentially going to introduce vulnerabilities. How do you know? So, you know, there are technologies like CyberX from Microsoft that allow you to secure down to the chip within the device. And same with the Refirm that we announced we acquired overnight, where again it's down to the firmware that you're able to secure these devices. So I think technology and security will catch up. I don't think it's there yet. But once you get to the point where some of these major security vendors have evolved their technology a little bit more, you know, these devices will be monitored and managed like any other device. It's just not there yet.
Yeah. And David, over the past year, one of the big changes we saw globally was the increase in retail e-commerce. There was an enormous leap forward in the volume of activity. At this time last year, in May and June of 2020, something like 85,000 businesses in the UK switched on their e-commerce service for the first time. And the numbers for Ireland, given the scale of our economy, are probably pro rata similar. Overall, e-commerce business last year globally grew by about 27%. So a lot of money is now moving through digital retail, online retail, in a way that wasn't there historically. And this must represent another attractive opportunity for cyber criminals. So those who have e-commerce now, maybe for the first time, maybe they don't fully understand this risk, must be feeling the threat there. Is that something you're seeing from your clients, David? This sort of early adoption of e-commerce, and then a bit of concern now emerging about, well, are we secure?
Well, absolutely. The increase in the number of pen tests that we're doing now, we've hired another 3 people just for that area alone, because the volume of requests we're getting in to test applications for PCI data, but also do penetration tests on their web apps, their e-commerce sites. So it's a huge area, and the criminals are just going, "This is great," and rubbing their hands. So yeah, we're seeing that all right, John.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, just as the point you made about how the nature of the threats have moved from really the consumer to the enterprise. That in the early days of cybercrime, ransomware, etc., they tended to be, naive. Although there was a large volume of them, they were generalized. They were naive. They were trying to hit, anyone and everybody. And then there's this move more towards, targeted attacks. Does that suggest that the cyber criminals might be using machine learning or other AI capabilities to help them? Or is that where we're getting to, that they're becoming as sophisticated as the most sophisticated enterprise?
Well, if people continue to pay $40 million ransoms, they are certainly equipped to be able to go there. Yeah, look, they are getting more and more sophisticated. They are definitely, there's no question, they're also using automation. Where they're going to go, I think we will, we'll probably always be on their tail a little bit. And you can already see, that they, as in the SamSam version, they're there. People get a little bit too close in terms of catching them, they disappear, they reinvent themselves. I think the evolution of the affiliate programs in terms of them renting out or providing a service is fascinating. So yeah, look, it is interesting, but yeah, they are very well equipped. They're brazen, and they are opportunistic. They will, any opportunity they have to compromise or to use something that's going on to their benefit, they will.
Oh, thanks, Des. So perhaps from the audience then, does anyone have a question they'd like to ask? If you do, just simply perhaps come off mute and ask away.
I see one there in the chat, John. If you want, I can take that one. Somebody's asked, can you advise on adequate backup strategy for an SME to counter the effects of a ransomware attack? So what I would recommend there is that you enable multi-factor authentication on your backups as well. And if you can encrypt them, great, because if somebody gets into your main system, your main service, they can easily get to your backups unless you have some form of protection on your backup as well.
Yeah, I concur. Backups again, in terms of the mode of operation of some of these guys. Remember that they're in there for 6 or 7 weeks before they pounce. It's not uncommon for backups to be restored as part of a recovery, only to find that they are also infected. So anything you can do to protect your backups is important. MFA is a great starting point.
Absolutely. I think David McCauley, you're keen to ask a question. We're getting a bit of echo on your line.
I am, thank you. One of the things, obviously, you know, you hear a lot about the Chinese and how suddenly they're militarized and they've got all these wonderful airplanes and destroyers and everything else. And the sort of unwritten perception is that, of course, they steal intellectual property. As somebody who's about to build a facility that will be hopefully stuffed with new ideas and patentable, I suppose patentable inventions would be the way to describe it. How do you protect in that environment? I mean, apart from the obvious policies and processes that have been very articulately outlined today, I mean, are there any particular issues in terms of patentable intellectual property, other than it's just sensitive data? You would put it in that bucket. And the supplementary question, the other question is, in terms of communicating with a wider community, one of the things I'm about to do is, what I'm doing at the moment, is launching a Discord server to try and engage. You know, we talked about this being, you know, 2026. I think people would be much more comfortable with a digital dialogue than maybe they would have been a couple of years ago. So those of you who know about Discord, it was born out of the gaming industry in 2015, I think, but it's now been adopted in the corporate world quite aggressively in America. It's essentially an integrated communications platform. It's got video, voice, text, all very, very well put together. They've received a stack of money from the VC community to sort of pursue this. And a lot of people are seeing it as the next big thing. God, if I had €1 for every time we've heard that, John, you know, we'd be sitting in the Bahamas. But it does seem to be a very well put together product, and it continually evolves. And it was born out of the gaming community, so it's actually quite a nice product, and it doesn't have all the corporate nonsense that goes with corporate products. You know, it's very easy to use. It's free at point of use, although you can have a more you can pay a fee and have slightly better options. But it allows you to video. You know, you think of Clubhouse in the States, that's been very successful. You think of the sort of Zoom conferencing, and it really brings a lot of that together into one platform that's much more sort of 24/7. It's I suppose it started off text-based, but you know, I've got two-factor 2FA activated on that. But of course, you know, so you think about how. So the question then really is two parts. One, how do you secure intellectual property in a laboratory research environment, if anybody's any experience of that? And secondly, how do you avoid the risks that would go with a sort of open platform? What techniques and processes? Bear in mind that you are bending over there to some extent. Sorry, bad analogy there. But you know, you are exposing yourself to some extent. So in terms of communicating with the wider community, and then specifically in the lab, I'll shut up now. I've probably over-explained it, confused myself. But they're two very different questions, I guess.
First one, I'd say, apart from physical separation and keeping your IP off of an internet accessible device is probably your first protocol. After that, you know, it's like any sensitive data. There are DLP. DLP is probably the key thing, in making sure that it's very, very tightly configured. Not a whole lot more that I've got experience of in terms of that.
So I'd agree. You know, if you're trying to protect your IP, you know, keep it off the internet, keep it separate. And then in terms of dealing with another platform that's out there, I think normally you'd ask them a series of security questions. What are they doing for security? What standards are they adhering? Am I back?
You're back, David.
Sorry, yeah. So I'd ask them those series of questions in terms of their internet security. and what they do themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'd agree. I don't know the other platform that you're talking about, so I can't really comment on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
John, I just have a quick question and an observation. So speaking on behalf of the SME community out there who are completely daunted, they don't have the resources or their knowledge. So the observation is, I run a recruitment business. We're guard vetted every year. We have thousands of people's CVs, their salary expectations, a lot of personal information. So, God help us if we're breached. So the observation is WannaCry scared the living hell out of me and a lot of recruiters. I ran off to PC World and bought a 5 terabit external drive. I used 2 cloud storage, the big names. I made sure they were within the EU. And so I back everything up to those. That's where my business is on those 2. I back up off my machine here, but once a month, I go to the family safe at home. I take this thing out and I download everything from all the places onto this and then just lock it away. So I know it sounds crude and basic, but I just have one of these days, one of the big cloud storage providers will be attacked. I'm not saying it's likely, but it can happen. My question, so that's just an observation how an SME owner can be spooked, and WannaCry really spooked me. My question is, we all use Apple products with Microsoft software on the Apple. I know they're not 100% safe, but is that a good combination, Microsoft software on Apple hardware?
It all depends on the controls, really, doesn't it? Sorry, Des, go on.
Look, I guess if I had my sales hat on, I would say it's better to run Microsoft on Microsoft hardware, right? The reality is, if you think about the philosophies of both of those companies, so Microsoft runs on trust is a very, very strong mantra, and very, 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 very rarely will we, our first answer always when we're asked for access to data from law enforcement is no. And I think there's only been 1 or 2 cases where it's actually happened, and so we have a very strong trust and security position. Apple are very similar. I don't work for Apple. I can't speak for them, but they also have a very strong security bent to what they do. So I would say, yeah, it sounds like a solid combo, but that's me without my sales hat on.
Yeah, and again, as long as you're following some security principles by enabling 2-factor authentication to protect your data as much as possible, that's all you can do, really. If you're operating off a phone, So yeah.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks, Bob, for the question. Thanks, Des, David. Are there any other questions? We can probably move to the final section if there aren't.
John, can you hear me?
How are you?
Good to see you again. Just had one question there in the chat box. In terms of any specific advice you'd offer educational institutions, obviously there's been a spate of attacks recently, but anything unique about education that you might comment on?
So I can tell you that there's definitely seems to be a spike in education attacks. There are 4 third-level organizations that I'm aware of at the moment on the island who have been compromised. I think the challenge with education is you've got a very transient population. You've got pupils coming and going. You often have a philosophy of open access, particularly in universities, to allow for research and for various bits and pieces. So it can be particularly vulnerable from that perspective. But the same principles apply regardless of the industry, to be honest with you.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'd echo that. So I think again, these are young adults coming into your organization. They'll click on links. They're hungry for knowledge. people are working from home or being educated at home using different platforms, be it Moodle or Blackboard or whatever it's going to be in terms of the e-learning platform. But it is educating them and maybe getting them to follow some sort of security principle and enforcing that. Yeah.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Thanks, Benber.
Yeah, so it's amazing how the cyber criminals, okay, they hit HSE, they hit, as you say, there's also 4 educational establishments. You can hear the concern from Bob as well in relation to SMEs, just as Finbar is related in relation to educational sector. So it's not just the classic sort of, bank or financial processor. It's all kinds of organizations. So when we look at small to medium-sized enterprises in the northeast of Ireland, where the Data Value Hub is based, I mean, it's as vulnerable in that sense as any other part of the world, and unfortunately, the same rules apply to everybody. The ideas shared in your update, Des, and in yours as well, David, around understanding the threat, conducting the right level of audit and scrutiny, taking the right countermeasures, and I suppose the vigilance, the ever vigilance question. And you mentioned, zero-day attacks. Also, both of you, the idea that the cyber criminals are constantly innovating and trying to hit you with something you couldn't have seen before. So in terms of the outlook, then, I suppose, Des, from your perspective, when you take an outlook, we're coming up to the halfway point in 2021. I mean, are we halfway through a crisis, or are we going deeper into one, or are we coming out of one? Or is it impossible to say?
It's impossible to say. My own perspective, and this isn't Microsoft's perspective, this is my own personal opinion. This isn't going to go away. It's been around, as I pointed out, since 1989. So it'll evolve, it'll continue to evolve. New technologies will come out that will prevent particular styles of attacks. But the criminals will evolve, and they will find new ways. So I think we'll have to live with this. It's kind of part and parcel of internet life. Maybe that's too pessimistic a view, but I honestly think that's the case. The reality here is, as long as people are not taking the right level of care, the opportunity is there, and where there's an opportunity, there's always a criminal. So I think it's going to be around long term. I'm concerned about the spike over the last 4 or 5 months. There's no question I'm seeing a massive spike. I speak at these kinds of events very, very regularly to highlight the risk, not to sell Microsoft product, but to make sure people are taking it seriously. I hope this spike is a short-term thing. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Des. And David, your view on that also?
Yeah. As Des said in one of his slides there, it's as old as time itself is corruption, and people trying to pull one over on somebody else, and that's going to continue. Also, IT is dysfunctional by its nature. There's different languages out there, there's different products, there's different ways they're set up, there's different configurations, and trying to legislate for absolutely everything, and with new technology coming all the time, it's impossible to say how long. Like, no security provider will stand up and say, I can guarantee you 100% that you'll never get attacked. That's just nobody would sign up to that, not even Microsoft. So it happens. With the best will of the world, you've just got to make yourself unattractive. It's like your house. You protect your house. You don't just lock the door. You start putting an alarm on it. You might have cameras on the outside. You might get a dog. You might get a security guard. It's all the different layers that you're going to put onto it. I suppose that's the best analogy I could use.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Des. Yeah. So we're in this world of, in this increasingly digitized world we are in a world of increasing threat, and businesses need to look at opportunity and threat equally and carefully. So I guess the disruption of COVID was enormous, and businesses had to focus on remote working, fulfilling customer orders, in many cases having to move to an e-commerce platform for the first time, or certainly moving to electronic media as opposed to paper delivery dockets or paper-based invoicing. So all of those disruptions, and while that was all going on, cyber criminals were watching and probing and trying to find ways in, while businesses were perhaps distracted with these other concerns. So what we'll do, we'll move on to the last section, and it's a very short section. It's really just the question around how to engage with the data value hub. So there are really three things that we do for an enterprise. The first one is we'll do an assessment of maturity. So many businesses will acknowledge that they could do much more with their digital maturity and much more with their process maturity. And so if you think of Intel's factory in Leixlip, they're at level 5. They are exemplars at process maturity and exemplars at digital maturity. Not every business needs to be at that level, but every business probably needs to know what is their current level, and equally, what level do they aspire to. So that's something we help with. We also help with incubator projects. The idea being that businesses have an idea around how they could run their processes faster or better or simpler, or maybe they have a concept around a way to serve their customer in a novel way, or maybe even the product itself is becoming a digitized product. So if all of that leads into something, we then work with the enterprise to define the benefit. We look for the commitment that people would be able to work on it. And of course, very importantly, that there is data, because essentially what we're doing is we're advancing the cause for the adoption of new technology, artificial intelligence. And when people hear artificial intelligence, sometimes they can be intimidated by that term, but it's really what we're saying in a nutshell is new technology that can help you make better decisions faster, which is at the essence of computerization and digitization too. So AI, artificial intelligence, is another way to say the same thing. But in particular, we often talk about machine learning algorithms. So if you have vast data sets and you're curious about a pattern in the data, there is technology available that we can help you get around that, machine learning in specific terms. And then when it comes to upskilling, we focus in on three different areas: productivity, process, and analytics. We also run sessions like this one on cybersecurity, and our next set of sessions will be on topics such as robotic process automation, gaining productivity by using Office 365 in a certain way, and also the whole world of customer sentiment and how artificial intelligence is helping there. Our office, we're based in the MTech building in Monaghan, so we serve the broader Northeast region, but we're also working with companies right across Ireland while we're based in the Northeast. In the digital world, geography means less and less. You can find out more about us on our website. We're sponsored by organizations including Microsoft and Intel. We're funded by Enterprise Ireland and Monaghan County Council, and we work with a number of state research centres, including the Irish Manufacturing Research Centre. So in a nutshell, I suppose the closing thoughts: COVID-19 has changed our world. We're seeing unprecedented digitization right around us in every dimension: our suppliers, our customers, in our homes, right across our businesses. It's a world in which data is the new currency. And as a consequence, it's a world in which cyber criminals are innovating to steal that very same data. So if you have any questions and follow-up, please contact me. Obviously contact Des or David also. And thank you for attending this event today. Thank you. Thank you.
John, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Have a good day. Yeah, thanks very much, John. Thanks very much, John. Thanks, Des. All right, thanks everyone. Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.